Welcome everyone to the Engineering and Operations Management Lunch and Learn webinar series. As part of our Lunch and Learn series offered by the Engineering and Operations Management Department here at the University of Arkansas. My name is Karen Hickenbotham, and I'm the Program Manager in the Operations Management Program. Our department does offer 3 online degree options through the Industrial Engineering Department. We have a Master's of Science in Operations Management, a Master of Science in Engineering Management, and a Master's of Science in Engineering. And if you have any questions about those, we will be happy to address those at the end of the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. Please save all questions until the end of the presentation, and those will be typed in the chat box. Please do not use the raise hand feature in this session, as it is a distraction to the presenters. And this session is being recorded and will be posted across multiple mediums. So without further ado, today's presenter, we have Travis McNeal. Travis has led the change management efforts for numerous transformation efforts for several Fortune 500 companies. Some of these transformations Travis has led and been in supply chain, HR modernization, reliability improvement, maintenance, transportation, and more. So I will go ahead and hand it over to Travis for our presentation today in change management, increasing the odds of adoptions. Travis, welcome.
Very good. Let me just do a check here. Can everyone hear my audio okay? Is there any echoes, any cutting out? Are we good?
You are all good, Travis. Thank you for checking.
Very good. Well, please stop me if it does cut out. So anyhow, thanks for the chance to be here today. So throughout my career in change management and strategy execution, I've often heard people say, we need change management. And what they're saying in most cases that they really need people to start behaving differently, or said another way, people need to adopt a new way of working. And it's not that easy to convince people to do something they just may not want to do. And so as organizational leaders, the challenge is, how do we stack the deck in our favor to increase the chances to build adoption? And that's what the topic that we'll explore today. So what we'll cover today is the objective that we'll have is we'd like to equip everyone here with some tools that they can use to take immediately away that you can increase the chances that your project, whatever project it is that you're working on, will be successful. And so the agenda that we've laid out is really talk through what successful change management looks like, the difference between change management and change leadership. There are some distinctions that we'd like to cover. Talk through what are some of the key ingredients for successful change, introduce to you what we call the behavior equation, and then wrap it up with any questions that we may have. And we'll spend the bulk of the time really on that behavior equation piece, as you'll see. So I think most of us would agree that 2020 has been a hugely disruptive year for us, and there's still 3 months left of the year. But one thing that's happened that I think if we take a pause and look through, that no one would have expected or predicted at the start of this year, is the adoption of large people across the country and even the world who are wearing masks. Now, if you were to go back to February and go through a store, if you were to see people wearing a mask, chances are we'd kind of look at them with a cocked head, maybe going, that's curious. But now in many parts of the country, that reaction has actually flipped, where when we're going through a store, particularly here in Northwest Arkansas, if we see people not wearing a mask, that's when we do a double take now. And people wearing masks is really more the norm now than it was before. And so regardless of the point of view you find yourself on, whether we should or shouldn't wear masks, I think standing back from a change management point of view, it's quite remarkable to see such a huge, dramatic change in that cultural norm of wearing a mask. And because of this widespread adoption, I think we'd be wise to take a little bit closer look at what happened that made such a widespread adoption possible. And so when it comes to changing people's behavior, really, when it comes down to it, people have a choice. They have a choice today when it comes to wearing a mask. And it all begins at the bottom of this slide here, where there's a point in time where we're all told we need to do something. And at this point in time, when it comes to wearing masks, we were told back in March that we should be wearing masks. And it was at this point in time where you begin to see 2 different camps begin to diverge. And some had a positive perception of mask wearing, while others didn't. Others may have had a more negative perception. So for those who were more on that positive side, they may have seen mask wearing as a way to keep people safe. Now, that perception will then likely guide you to have a greater understanding of the benefits of wearing a mask. As a result, you take another step up on that right-hand side of that curve, where people might even start to wear masks in places where they may not need them. And then what ultimately leads to people to encouraging, you might encourage your family, you might encourage others that you see to wear masks. Now, however, if you go to the other side, for those people who may have had a negative perception of that, maybe they felt threatened. Maybe they felt that there was an infringement on their rights. And as a result of that feeling of being threatened, that may have led to some confusion. They may have heard people say, masks help, but then heard other experts say, well, it doesn't really help. So that just leads to additional confusion, which may then lead people to not wearing masks out in public. And as time goes on, maybe they took it a bit further. And if they were confronted by people asking them why they're not wearing a mask, maybe they had a reaction to dig their heels in a little deeper. And maybe they even went to the extreme of, trying to persuade others that wearing masks isn't important. Now, we're not trying to have a debate on the mask, and regardless of where you fall in this great mask debate, the reasons why I think and where you see widespread adoption are still worth considering. Now, and particularly when it comes to organizational change. Now, let me tell you one more story about a large change that happened at a large North American oil refinery. So on January 1st, many years ago, this refinery had a huge celebration. And what had happened is they had just gone an entire calendar year without an unplanned shutdown. Now, an unplanned shutdown is really where a piece of equipment breaks severely enough to where a portion of the refinery actually has to be turned off, sometimes for weeks, just to make those repairs. It's very costly, both from a repair standpoint and also from a lost production standpoint. So think about all the gasoline that is not being made when a refinery is shut down. So it's pretty significant. And so why was this going a whole calendar year such a big deal? Well, what had happened is just 4 years before, this exact same refinery had 32 within 1 year. A calendar year, they had 32 unplanned shutdowns. Said another way, they averaged an unplanned shutdown every 12 days. Now, that's a lot. And they were losing close to $150 million a year just through these unplanned shutdowns. And it was at that point in time that the refinery leaders got together and said, we've got to do something different. We have got to change our culture around reliability. And the culture at that point in time was the ownership of reliability really fell to one group. And what they wanted people to do was everyone in that refinery owned a piece of reliability. And so how do you drive that culture change to everyone feeling like they own reliability? And they, in fact, had set a goal that said, our goal is 0 unplanned shutdowns. And at the time, that goal was largely seen as symbolic, same way we say our goal is 0 injuries. It was very aspirational, but there was really no expectation to actually achieve that goal. But fast forward just 4 years, and they were able to achieve what they thought was impossible. And the thing to point out, though, is that didn't happen by accident. It was deliberate. And so what they did and what other companies would do, many of you have probably been a part of some of these transformations, there's things that they did that made it successful. And so let's talk about what success looks like. And so when we think about a successful project, oftentimes we'll say, success is defined by a project that's delivered on time, on budget, and the process or the technology works as it was designed. And we call that installation in the change management world. But does that mean that the project was actually successful? Well, not necessarily. Even if you meet those big three, if people don't follow the new processes or use the new technology, which said another way is behaving in a different way, you're not going to see the business benefits that make up the business case that you had originally. And so only when you achieve those, where you have people that behave differently and that where you can achieve the programs, can we actually say the program was successful. And when programs, or said another way, when programs and projects are adopted quickly and permanently, that's when we can declare success, that our project was in fact successful. So, and how you could almost articulate this is those top three are really have more ownership within the project team, the team that's actually leading that project. And the bottom ones are really more the result of how well is leadership leading through change once it goes live. And that's partly true. So let's park there for a minute. So let's talk about the role that leaders play. So leaders play a crucial role in driving adoption. We get it. It cannot be done by the program. There are things that leaders can do that the program team or the project team just can't do. Leading change is the responsibility of the business. And when we talk about leaders, people will often say, well, who is the change leader? And the simple answer is, we really don't need to overcomplicate it, is if you had direct reports that would be impacted by a change, you are a change leader, period. One could argue that, the most important change leaders are those on the front line, but I think you can make a case in one way or another. But really what this sponsorship spine really tries to say is each leader, if they have direct reports, they play a crucial role in driving adoption. It's not something that can be delegated. It's not something that you can, pass off to someone else. It is a responsibility of the leader. But the good news is, though, is that it can be learned, and we'll come back to that later. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, you really need both. You need change management, which is really owned by the project team, and you need change leadership, which is really owned by the leaders who are going to be driving the change going forward. Both work together to really drive the success of that implementation, as we had talked about earlier. For the purposes of today, we could actually spend a whole other webinar just talking about change leadership, and we've done that before. But for today, we're going to focus just on that change management piece. So what can project leaders do to set up the organization in the best way so the organization can have the greatest chance at succeeding in achieving that implementation? And for many of you, I think some of you have probably taken a class, maybe you've read a book or practiced change management yourself, maybe worked with consultants. So some of these change management elements may be familiar to you, and each one of these are very important in driving successful change management. The challenge, though, is that not everyone is as fluent in these change management best practices as some of you may be. And if someone is new to the whole change management space, all of these words can be a little overwhelming. Some people might think that it's too theoretical. Maybe they feel that there's too many tools, or there's some debate about which methodology is the right methodology. There's a handful of them out there, and which one is the right one? And if you do have a methodology, do you have to follow it step by step, or can you go back and forth? And so today, instead of giving you a step-by-step process for change management and how you go from one phase to another phase and so on, the approach we'd like to take today and to provide to you is really to give you a checklist of sorts. So in that way you can see, well, what are the key ingredients that are needed and that really have demonstrated success over time, that give you the greatest chance for your program to achieve that adoption and implementation that you're looking for. And that checklist is really one checklist that we've used in the past is what we call the behavior equation. Now, I stole this from a company that I worked for many years ago called CLG or Alula, but I've seen over the course of my career, it works pretty consistently as well as any other, quote unquote methodology. And this really isn't a methodology, it's more of a checklist. And really what we're looking at, if you go on the far right-hand side of that picture, there's a behavior that we're striving for, whether it's adopting a new process, a new technology, a new policy, whatever behavior it is that you're looking for, there's key things that need to be in place for that to happen. And if you're to go down the line, direction. Do people know what it is they're being asked to change? Do they know what the benefits will be? Is it crystal clear to them the role they play and what they're being asked to do? And do they understand what happens if people don't change? When it comes to capability, do people have the knowledge, skills, and ability to do what it is they're being asked to do? Opportunity. Do people have enough time? Do they have the right tools? Do they have the right authority, the right technology, and so on, for them to meet the expectations that have been asked of them? And lastly, do people have a reason or a purpose why they would want to change? And what we found is that when each one of these elements are met, your odds of gaining adoption increase significantly. Now we'll spend the next few moments breaking each one of them down in a little bit more detail. So when it comes to direction, you were really talking about communication. So do people know what's being asked of them, why they're being asked to change, what happens if a change isn't made, how progress will be measured, and many more things. And this is primarily accomplished through communication. So What I'd like to do now is just do a little exercise with you. So let's just say that you are told to go listen to Keith Jarrett's 1975 concert, and I think that colon is spelled incorrectly, but you're asked to go listen to that 1975 Keith Jarrett's concert, but you're really not that interested. So you have two options here, option A and option B. Which one of these options is going to compel you most to go listen to that album? Both columns are true, but both carry a different message. Column A really has a set of facts and figures. It's listed as on the 101 or 1001 albums to listen to before you die. It's the #1 selling piano album of all time. It's the #1 selling solo jazz album of all time. Now that gets at your facts and figures. Column B, on the other hand, provides a little bit additional context. So what happened is in Keith Jarrett, he almost didn't play the concert because the piano that he was asked to play, was terrible. He was playing before an audience of 1,500 people in a large concert hall, and he had a baby grand piano instead of the grand piano that he was used to. It was out of tune. It was the upper register keys weren't working, and so the piano just wasn't that great. The other thing is that a 17-year-old girl who was the producer, her name was Vera, she had convinced him to go play the piano standing in pouring rain, basically begging and pleading him to not leave, to just continue to play. The third thing is that he agreed to play and have it recorded basically for two reasons. One, he had compassion on the 17-year-old Vera, and two, he wanted to record it so it could serve as a warning to other concert producers that here's what's happened when you don't give me the piano that I need. So he was expecting it to be a disaster. And in fact, as if you were to go listen to the album, you'll see the stats on the left-hand side. It was one of his greatest concerts that he ever had. And so faced with those two things, which communication really compels you most to want to go listen to that album? Well, the answer is it might be both. And so as you're drafting communications, sometimes you have to take into consideration multiple perspectives and not just one perspective of facts and figures or one perspective of the stories. And so as you're thinking about communicating, what is it that we should be communicating when it comes to the change? And again, this won't be a secret to most of you, but when you communicate, it's important to tell people what's changing and what's not changing. What is the reason for the change being made? And why now? And there have been some other studies done by Gartner that show, people, when they're asked to change, they often are okay with the change if they're explaining the reasons why they're doing the change. And people also want to know, how is it going to impact me and those that I work with? So what's in it for me? And then finally, what's the plan and what can I expect next? So now that we have the meat of what we need to communicate, the next challenge is how do we communicate in a way where the majority of people will get it and buy into that vision? To help tell the story, there are a few key points to include. So this success is actually taken from Chip and Dan Heath. They wrote a book called Made to Stick. And they've given basically 6 ways in which you can keep your message where it resonates with the greatest number of people. So the first thing is keep it simple. So going back to our mask example, when it comes to wearing masks, the message was wear your masks indoors and in public places. It wasn't that complex. And so it was very simple. When possible, try to keep it unexpected. C, which is be concrete. Have it unambiguous as to how people need to behave, where people can visualize what in fact is needed, not necessarily with abstract ideas. I don't know how many times I've heard people say, well, they need to be a role model. Well, that's a little too vague. It needs to be a little bit more concrete. And it needs to provide some credibility. There are many organizations and political candidates that use celebrities and experts in their advertisements, and they do this really to lend credibility to their ideas. Use emotions. There's research that shows that people are more likely to commit to a cause when they have a feeling of attachment to it in some way or another. And lastly, use stories. If you look at some of the greatest communicators or orators, they oftentimes will inject stories, and it's just easier for people to remember stories. And the last piece to really cover about communications is that sequence matters. It's very difficult for managers to play the role of the sponsors that we need them to play if they're on the same commitment trajectory as those they lead. Several years ago, There's a company I worked for where they rolled out a new PTO accrual process. And several people had questions about how they would accrue a PTO when they went to their manager. And because the manager had found out at the exact same time as their employees, you know, you almost hate to hear these words, but their response was, I have no clue. I found out the same time as you did. Now, when that happens, what do you think that does to the credibility of the managers? And how do you think the manager feels when he learned about it at the same time his or her associates or employees learn about it? You know, and how much confidence, think about the employees, how much confidence do they have in the company? Wouldn't it have been better to let the managers know before the employees? Then they could have asked all the questions that they knew they were going to face. And so the sequence in which people communicate does matter. All right. So now that the direction has been clearly laid out, and there's no doubt that this is the right thing to do in everyone's mind, the next question that we need to ask is, can they do it? And this is where training comes into play. Not every time, but in most times, there is some element of training that will be needed for a specific program. And so what might that look like? So the first thing we want to cover is really, how do we build the technical skills? Now, training for skills may be needed when you're introducing a new policy, maybe you're introducing a new technology or new machinery or equipment. Anytime you're introducing new technology, which is hardware and software, and lastly, anytime there's going to be an introduction of a new process, you can pretty well guess that training will be needed. Now, the kind of training will depend on what's available, what's needed, what's the appetite of the business, and what's your budget. These are all simple constraints that need to be taken into account. And each of these types of training has their own sets of disadvantages and advantages. Some ways to build skills can be instructor-led, computer-based learning, quick reference guides, or said another way, step-by-step guides, or you've probably seen, you know, YouTube video type training. And so when you're designing your training program, here's some different ways that you can package them together, or they could all be done, there could be some combination of the four. Again, each has its own advantages and disadvantages, so you just really need to determine which is the right one for your program. But there may be more needed than simply building job skills that oftentimes are overlooked by a lot of organizations. And that's really around, what do we do with our leaders? Now, as we mentioned earlier, leading change is not a part of this webinar, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. Now, if most experts agree that leading change is so vital, shouldn't we train it? Because at one point, the project team is going to go away, and the business leaders will need to own the program going forward. So as a project team, we owe it to the leaders to help prepare them for this transition. So some of the training should be targeted to build their leadership skills around this program. Now, some skills you could be considered, now keep in mind this list is not all inclusive, but there are things like how to provide effective feedback, and we'll spend a bit more time on this later. How do you communicate? So when we talk about delivering that message earlier, do they need to be trained on how to deliver that message effectively? Asking questions or coaching rather than simply telling and said a little bit more harshly, accusing. And similarly, some skills to improve listening. Now, there could be many more, but the bottom line is that we can't forget that when it comes to implementing a new change, our leaders do have to have the change of leadership skills needed. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, do they have that? And if not, can we build that? So now that people understand what's changing, why we're changing it, how they're going to be impacted, and how this is going to benefit the organization, and now they've been trained both on the technical aspects of the new job and as well as their leadership aspects, the next question we want to ask ourselves is, do they have the skills they need, or do they have all the things in their toolbox they need to be successful? Which gets at our opportunity. And so as you're trying to understand, do they have what they need? Here are a few things that can prevent people from fulfilling the expectations that have been set. Do people have enough time? Do they have all the right tools? What about authority? Do they have the authority and the right systems to do what they've been asked to do? Do they have the equipment that they need? And when you think about our mask example, many places, I've seen Home Depot, some other sporting event places, they solved this problem by providing complimentary masks. And one thing that I never thought I would see was people on the side of the road set up a little stand, almost it looked like the old lemonade stands where they were selling homemade masks. You know, who would have thought that would have happened, 6 months ago? And so the availability of masks has not really been the issue. If you really wanted to wear a mask, they were available for people if they wanted it. And another item that is often overlooked is that relevant information bullet point there, the second from the top on the far right, on the right-hand side. And so let me go back to the refinery example that I shared with you earlier. So they were trying to improve reliability, and there were many things that they were doing to improve. Two of those were to improve preventive maintenance compliance and the frequency with which operators conducted surveillance rounds. Now, managers were bought in. That wasn't an issue. They knew it was important, but it was really hard for them to tell on a regular basis how their teams were doing. Managers didn't have a way to review the aggregate data to see if they were doing good or needed to improve. So it was difficult for managers to lead change when they didn't have the data readily available to them. But once they were provided with accurate data that they had confidence in, they actually became very good change leaders. And as you can see from these graphs, once they were able to provide the relevant feedback to their teams, they were actually able to significantly increase their PM compliance and their rounds completed. And in another example, we were about to roll out a new round of expectations to a group of associates where they needed to continue being productive up until 10 minutes before their shift ended. And what they were doing before was that they were stopping their shift at 30 minutes before the shift ended to begin engaging in other types of cleaning activities. And so they wanted to extend that time till 10 minutes before the shift ended. Now, when we asked employees if they thought this would be possible, we had heard a number of them say, sure, but if we're still expected to clean our area before the end of our shift, we'll need more brooms. If I spend 15 minutes at the end of my shift just looking for a broom. And so it's a very simple fix, but they're out there. And so as project leaders, we owe it to those people to ensure that they have everything they need to meet the expectations that have been set forth. So now that people have the direction, they've been trained, and they have all the tools and resources they need to be effective, if you're still not getting the behavior, that changes the dynamic a bit. It now becomes a choice that people make, which is the motivation piece. And that comes down to what incentives are at play. While this is still a choice the individuals make, we still can stack the deck in our favor. But we need to know a little bit more about how human behavior works and look at the naturally occurring incentives and engineer them into our program a little differently. And this is really where leadership plays the biggest role, and it becomes less about the project team. So to get us started, to explain incentives, I'll use a very simple example. It may seem very basic to many of you, but go with me on this. So when you look at the 100 years of research that's been done in behavioral sciences, what this slide says is really that for all behavior, there are two things that influence it: the consequences, or the antecedents and the consequences. The antecedents tell us to do something, and the consequences either reinforce that behavior, making it more likely to happen in the future, or punish it, making it less likely to occur. Now, what the science shows is that the consequences carry far more weight than the antecedents in determining how likely that behavior will stick. Now, here's a simple example that I think we all can relate to. So we're driving down the road, and we come to a red light at an intersection. The red light is the antecedent. It is not, when you think about it, the red light is not stopping the car for us. But as automatic as it is, we still have a choice whether or not we want to push the brake. And again, it happens pretty rapidly, but we think, what happens if we do press on the brake, and what happens if we don't? If we do, what you'll see under the consequence are a series of consequences, some good, some bad, but in most cases, the incentives to stop are far greater than the incentives not to stop, so we stop. Now, put us in a different circumstance. We're driving on the freeway, and we see a speed limit sign, yet we and many others often disobey the speed limit sign. Now, it's interesting because the same elements exist. There's an antecedent, the speed limit sign, and there's a behavior that we're expected to adhere to. But yet we're more likely to adhere to one and not the other. Why is that? And the answer really lies in the consequences. There are still good and bad consequences, but in the speed limit example, the incentives to obey the speed limit sign are just not as strong enough. They're not bad. The people are good people. It's just the incentives aren't aligned. And as leaders, they have the ability to change the environment. We can engineer the environment in a way to alter the consequences and change those incentives. So if you think about our freeway example, all we got to do is change one thing and we'll get greater adherence to that speed limit sign. And that one thing, oftentimes, if you put a policeman there or a police car, you'll see a difference in behavior just by altering the environment in one way. And that's really what we're talking about here. How do we equip leaders with enough tools to where they can change the incentives to generate the change that's needed in their organization? Now, for one company that I worked for a while back, there was this leader said a quote, and she was a executive in one of the Fortune 50 companies that I worked for. And she had said, as they were kicking off a change program to the leadership, to the people who are going to be adopting this going forward, she had said, a poorly managed program can be overcome by exceptional leaders, but an exceptionally managed program cannot be overcome by poor leaders. And what she was really driving at was the fact of how important their leadership is. Leadership can make or break the difference in a change program. And the data bear this out too. So this is a study conducted by Deloitte, who, if you don't know about Deloitte, they're a large international consulting firm, and they help thousands of companies as they go through transitions. They did a study which highlights the importance of leadership, which they say leadership is the most important factor in driving successful changes. And what they found is that of the programs that they observed, 75 of them failed to meet their expected ROI. And if you look at the top 3 reasons, resistance by employees, inadequate sponsorship, and unrealistic expectations, all of those in one way or another tied directly back to leadership. And so at this point, it might be easy to feel like, well, the leaders are the ones who set the charge, and if it fails, it's on them. We've done all we can do. And that might be fair to a point, but remember, if our goal is not just to get installation, if our goal is to get implementation, I believe we can do more to ensure our leaders understand their role and the role that they play. And so what is it that leaders can do to be most effective? And again, we could spend an entire webinar on change leadership, so we'll be brief here. But what it shows that successful change leaders really do 3 things extremely well, and they do it consistently. They say, they do, and they recognize. And we'll break that down here just right now. The say part is really about clarifying expectations, the what, the why, and really setting that standard. And that carries about 10% weight. The do is all about modeling the priorities and allocating resources. Recognize is an ongoing interaction with their team. And when it comes to the impact on implementation, the say part is important, you got to do it, but the do part is twice as important. A person can talk all they want, but if they don't walk the walk, leaders lose credibility. And what's more important than those other 2 items is that recognize piece, which carries 3 times more importance on successful changes than the other 2. And what oftentimes I'm asked by leaders, so I just don't have time in my day to lead change like you want me to. And so oftentimes the simplest thing that I can say to them is, if you can just spend 10 minutes out of your day and find someone who's meeting expectations, tell them they're meeting expectations, or find someone who's struggling and ask them why. And if they can do those 3 things, they'll be very effective in leading change. And oftentimes the most effective recognition piece is not about giving awards or providing monetary incentives. It really comes down to feedback. And the benefits of feedback is that it carries a lot of weight. It doesn't cost you anything. It's available anytime. And when we talk about feedback, we're talking about real, honest, specific feedback. And so, but the thing is that providing feedback is still a leader's choice. And when we're in the planning stages of our program, we really need to take that into consideration. Because what's going to happen is that when a leader sees people adopting the new way of working, he or she has a choice. Do they say something or do they not? And what we need to do as project leaders is ensure that when they see that they're actually taking some kind of action. If they like what they see, make sure they provide positive feedback so they can get more of it. If they don't like what they see, make sure they're providing constructive feedback and help them restate expectations. And the third choice, which is still a choice, a leader can choose to do nothing, which unfortunately is what many leaders do. And when they do nothing, oftentimes that drives behavior in the opposite direction that we like. So as a project team, we need to make it very clear what a leader could and should do when they see people adopting the new ways of working and not adopting the new ways of working. Because if they don't provide feedback, they're really leaving it up to chance. And to illustrate the importance of that, let's go back to our mask example. So I'll put myself under the gun here. So I know what the benefits are about wearing a mask. I know why we need to do it, and I know when to do it. So I have all the direction, going back to our DCOM example, I have all the direction that I need. I also know how to wear a mask. It's not rocket science. So I clearly have the capability to wear the mask. And there are clearly plenty of masks available to me. You know, I've got plenty of masks in my car. You know, there are masks in stores. Their opportunity is not an issue. I then have a choice. Do I go into a store without a mask or do I not? If I choose to go into a store without a mask, what happens will then determine whether or not I continue to wear a mask or whether I don't. And if you think about it, if you're a leader, and in this case of wearing masks, it can be anyone, you know, you have a choice. Do you say something or do you not? If no one says anything to me about me not wearing a mask, that's going to influence my behavior. And what's likely going to happen is that I am going to continue to not wear a behavior. I'm not going to continue to wear a mask. If someone does say something to me, well, and that changes the equation. You know, I will likely behave in a different way. You know, and that could be different, but I will likely behave differently. And so, if we want that behavior change, there needs to be ongoing feedback. And you'll see that there's a recommended ratio down there where it says 4-to-1 positive versus corrective feedback. You know, and this is what the experts have said is kind of the right balance of, well, how often do I give positive feedback versus constructive feedback? And so the more, you know, typically you do a 4-to-1 ratio. Four times you give a positive recognition versus every one time that you have to give a constructive feedback, because you do have to give it. And the reason for that is because oftentimes people will, you know, pay more attention to the corrective than they do the positive. So now that all of those elements are in place, there's clear direction on the what and why and the expectations. People have been trained on how to perform the new tasks, and leaders have been trained on the importance of their role. And people have been given all the tools, the time, and the resources and authority that they need to be successful. And lastly, our leaders are incentivizing people to perform in the new way of working. Now, with all of these things in place, your program now stands a better chance than ever in being successful. And you can see proof of that every time you go into a store, because people have really adopted the new way of wearing masks.